everybody. Oh, I love your dancing. And we should start a dance party to this music for sure. Hi
Still with the
everybody.
music.
Sorry we're starting late. We've experienced some technical difficulties, but finally we're on air. So welcome to another episode of the Ergonautic podcast. And this is my lovely guest, Avi Douglen. And Avi, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what have you done in your career?
Sure. I am Avi Douglen. I lead consulting at Bounce Security, a small boutique consulting agency. We focus on product security and process transformation, things like integrating security into development processes, building out secure architecture, designing a security strategy. What is most important for our teams to be focusing on? Not exactly DevOps, but very much aligned with that way of thinking.
We can dive into, is
Sure.
DevSecOps a good term or is DevOps a good term? And like we can have all that discussion because if you like,
Yeah, we can do that. In short, I hate the term, but it's what we need to use right now.
it's
Good one
interesting
of them.
because I used to be kind of against the term, but now I'm like embracing it because we had some interesting discussions around how like explicitly mentioning security maybe makes people more aware about the fact that we need to have a conversation about it, we need to integrate it into process, right? So like sometimes giving language to people discussing things is a good thing, and that's the value of the term. That being said, I've also entered some conversations where people thought about DevSecOps only as it pertains to automating security, not so much about process integration. It's like,
So you know what? I'm very opinionated about this, and I'm going to dive into that. There are two things. First of all, I think the term needs to go away, but we need it right now. We need to talk about it because people are not talking about it, but it needs to just become one of those things. We don't talk about performance as completely separate from everything else. It's one of the things. We don't talk about usability or maintenance or all that other stuff that we need to have as one of the quality aspects of whatever product we're building. So we need that stuff. But right now, nobody's talking about it. So yeah, so we need to talk about it.
I do.
Definitely.
I have seen some pretty ridiculous like construction of blah 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 ops, like business, FinOps, marketing, whatever, everything integrated, right? And it's like, it kind of gets ridiculous at some point because like the
Yep.
whole concept was like, let's think about process integrating all the things into the value stream, right? Um, but you're right. Like we have to. So I think for security, the interesting part is A, it's really, really important, and B, it's really, really kind of pushed aside all the time, right? Because it's interesting because like people think about usability or accessibility before they think about security oftentimes. Like people think about stuff that sells more than stuff that prevents bad things from happening. And like, but like if you don't have security, like that's just that you have so much danger running with you. And so um on that topic, like actually it's interesting, like the interesting question that I guess I have is um I've I've heard from folks in security that like some of them like to like sort of scare customers into implementing security, and
Fun.
some of
It's
them
popular.
explicitly, right? And some of them explicitly avoid that like sort of scare tactic. But like, what's been your experience in terms of like how do you convince people to actually integrate security into the processes?
Look, nobody wants to pay extra for security, but they will pay less if it's not there. You're not going to pay extra for a car that doesn't explode. But if a car does tend to explode, you're not going to want to buy it, or you'll pay less for it if you can buy it on the cheap. Listen, a lot of companies, especially security consulting agents, companies, love to scare customers. You have to do this. Regulations, or the hackers are going to get in. I'm going to be a bit personal for a second. And the reason I named my company Bounce Security is to focus on the upside of things, to steer away from all the FUD and the scary and the sky is falling, right? But it can be a force multiplier. Very often we come in to developer teams to try and help them figure out how to do security, and we wind up helping them do development better, more efficiently, more effectively, because they're actually coming to the table and talking to the different stakeholders, different roles, in a way that they haven't before, and we're kind of forcing them. I've had this happen multiple times, that I come in to do a threat modeling exercise or teaching developers to do threat modeling. And for those that are not familiar with threat modeling, it's basically a structured framework to think about all the things that can go wrong, all the things that you need to deal with security before they become a problem, right? And if anyone's not familiar with it, go check out threatmodelingmanifesto.org. It's like a 4-minute read. A couple of years ago, some of the biggest people in the industry invited me to join them, and just called it a manifesto, basically structured like the Agile Manifesto, around what threat modeling should be, no matter how you do it. There's a lot of different ways to do it. You have some best practices, some anti-patterns there, values over principles, and things like that. Very short read, very powerful.
So this is very interesting. I think I have like a love-hate relationship with manifestos, because like on one side of it, words are useful and codifying practices is useful, and especially if like you coming into a new topic, like having someone with authority tell you what to do is like a good thing, right? Because otherwise you're just searching articles and everybody's trying to sell you something, and it's hard to make sense of things. But on the other hand of it is like a lot of times it becomes kind of religious, and people start being very dogmatic about something, and dogmatic about things that matter less than like providing value. And so like, and also like things evolve over time, and oftentimes whatever the topic is, like what we thought about 10 years ago kind of doesn't match what we think about now. And so that also becomes a problem.
Absolutely. And we made sure that the people that were involved, I think there's around 15 people involved in this, from very different, varied backgrounds, some academics, some practitioners, some educators, some scientists, some consultants like me, some vendors, but all very, basically we were looking for a very wide tent, as Adam Shostak called it, very wide tent that includes all the different approaches, all the different methodologies, basically breaking it down to the maximum common denominator between all these different approaches. And it's at a level of abstraction that these are almost truisms for a good threat modeling practice. It's not prescriptive. It's not you have to do this, this, and that, but it's rather a more generic approach to what good threat modeling is, which is have everybody included in the conversation and have everybody's perspectives, and don't lock anybody out, and take into consideration all these different ways of doing things.
So it's interesting. We do a lot of modeling in our consulting practice, right? Because it's useful, and it's not. I often find that it's not the modeling technique that is important. It's the fact that you fleshing things out, making them visible, and making people have conversations about the lines and the conflicts in between things. Is that kind of how it works with threat modeling for the most part?
100%. I like to say the threat model isn't important, but the threat modeling is. Nowadays there's a bunch of tools, a bunch of products that will help a lot of it. But at the end of the day, the only thing that's really important is getting all those stakeholders in the room, sitting down at a table and talking about what the heck security even means for me. How does the product even work? Everybody's familiar with the parable of 4 blind people describing this great big thing in the middle of the room, right? One describes a pillar, one describes a leathery ceiling, feather, hose, whatever. They're all describing an elephant. And very often I come to teams and they've never actually sat down. You got your developer, your architect, product management, DevOps, QA. Nobody actually sat down and how does this thing work? And I've had recently chief architect in the room is like, this is a waste of time. Of course, everybody does this. My architect and the architect in the room was like, no, we don't. And the product manager was like, should we start doing that? It's like, yes, of course we should do that. And that's exactly the conversation that we need to be having, is around those details, around how does this thing actually work? How does it do the thing that we're trying to do, and why? And how can it be broken?
So I think, and I want to kind of dive into this topic a little bit more. So interesting thing that I find in the industry, a lot of times it's easy to sell people software, right? And it's hard to sell people process, right?
Oh yeah.
And so, and I think so one of the reasons we started the business that we started is that we were all in the business of selling people software, and eventually you kind of run out of useful things that you can do with that software. Like, we can sell you an amazing platform that can facilitate you doing amazing things, but like eventually it's about your onboarding, it's about your processes. You're not going to gain more benefit out of integrating more tools into your stuff. Like, at some point, right, you have to improve what you actually do and how you do it. And that's kind of what everybody likes to gloss over, because the vendors selling you products is explicitly tell you, like, once you put this product in, you don't have to worry about people. Like, people don't matter. Like, you can hire, the junior people and they will be fine. Like, that kind of thing.
I feel like I need that big red button. Yes, 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 exactly. And this has been very much of our process and our experience based on this. You're absolutely right. They throw in all kinds of security tools, especially security, right? Whether it's static analysis or DAST or SEA, or I'm throwing out a lot of different terms because it's just a plethora of different kinds of tools out there, and plenty of commercial companies that will sell you dozens of different commercial products for a huge amount of money and just install it and you're good to go. And like you said, just ignore that. It's gotten to the point where my CTO, Josh Grossman, is actually going around doing training about the manual processes that are involved with automated software, the automated scanners. He's delivering the next one at a Black Hat in Vegas in the beginning of August. And it's just 2 days talking about, okay, I have this great big automated scanner, but what do I do about the human stuff? And it doesn't matter if you're doing static analysis with open source or complicated tools, distribute whatever kind of tools you have, and there are plenty of commercial tools out there, you still have to deal with that human process around it. How do I optimize this tool? How do I integrate it into the developer's workflow? How do I deal with the results? How do I make sure that they get fixed? How do I correlate this between all the other scanners that I'm running?
So speaking of that, so Insecurity, have you read the Investments Unlimited book at all?
Which one?
Investments Unlimited. So it's a sort of one of the new, like, basically, if you think of Phoenix Project, Unicorn Project, like this,
Okay.
another iteration of this, and talks about automated governance. And it's a really actually useful book. Like, if you getting started, trying to get into the topic of security and governance from kind of high level overview. And it's written as a novel, as a story. But I felt like, so I would recommend to people to read this book. It's like 4 hours, and it's like not a big undertaking. But I felt like the most naive part there was that they were solving technical problems throughout the book, right? And putting more tools in, And their biggest like issue was like, how do we like put this tool into this repo and kind of thing. And like, that's not like where your problems start. Like, you put the tool into the repo and then you get 1,500 alerts, and then you don't know what to do with them. Like, you don't even know where to start remediating all of this and what is important. And I like people, like, when you get this level of noise, usually you like start just blanket ignoring things, right? Or you what you do, spend 2 years trying to remediate every single issue that it flags. So what's your experience with that kind of stuff? I feel like it's very prevalent in security.
Incredibly prevalent. I mean, it's a painful experience. I feel like I'm wincing every time you say this. I've run into too many places that have this, and they have a policy. Yes, you need to run this static analysis tool, scan all your code on every release, and some places just ignore it. They have 3,000 SQL injections. Well, obviously, they're not going to fix that, right? Just leave that aside. Some places say, yeah, you have to have a clean result, no high risk. Great. So what do? They flag everything in the code and they start coding around the tool. And there's different ways of escaping it, with comments for each tool has a different syntax. And they just literally escape every place instead because it's easier than fixing it. So it's not any more secure. It's no way of managing that. And it's a heck of a lot less efficient. So we're just wasting time not doing anything. And this is exactly why we have this. Okay, so throwing a tool doesn't solve the problem. What does solve the problem? Education alone doesn't solve the problem either. And I think, Sasha, you have talked a lot about culture transformation. And that's exactly what we need on our side for security as well. It's not just the tool. I mean, it's a tool, right? If you don't use it right, it's not going to do the job. You can use a screwdriver to try and hammer in a screw, but it's not going to work well.
So it's interesting. I haven't even considered, like, I've seen a lot of people doing like blanket ignore, but that other thing, like coding around it, is like, it's even worse, like, because you spend time on doing that, and like you're actually not making it any better and definitely making it worse. And like, it's like, oh my God.
Yep. Listen, I always say developers are very creative. Manage them well, they'll be creative on the features. Manage them poorly, and to be very creative on how vulnerable they make your app.
It's very interesting. Like, I saw Tanya Junker tweet the other day. She was saying developers are like water. Whatever you put in front of them, they will go around. And I'm like, this is a really good description. Like, it's like so this is interesting. So you started off as a developer a long time ago, right? I also, long time ago, I spent 10 years writing code before I got into any other interesting topics. So like I hope we understand the developer mindset, and we understand. So one of the interesting things to me when I started looking at security topics, and I think to me it was when I started doing some CTF, so capture the flag events, and then I'm like, oh my God, like, no. So I have a computer science degree. No one ever told me not to code this way, ever. No one ever mentioned like SQL injection or any of these like cross-site scripting, whatever. Nothing ever was a part of my education that told me don't do this thing. And I'm like, it's not like developers are malicious. They just never heard of it, like, ever. Like, it wasn't part of educational materials. Whether you did a 6 months class or whether you did it for a 4-year degree, it just wasn't there.
Even worse, where do developers nowadays learn to code? Majority of them from Stack Overflow. Huge percentage of the code samples, even the accepted answers on Stack Overflow, are insecure code. I'm not even talking about intentionally making malicious or anything, simply putting bad code there. And if you expound that, all the AI generated code and GitHub Copilot and all that stuff, it's learning from the majority of code, and the majority of code is bad. The majority of code is insecure because most developers haven't learned that, and it's perpetuating a given situation.
It's interesting, right? It's so speaking of GitHub and security, when I was at GitHub, we talked a little bit about, so the GitHub internal data scientists ran a study, and they just like looked at all the code. Basically, their conclusion was more code, more problems, right? And that's specifically relating to security. So like, the more lines of code we write, the more security vulnerabilities we introduce. It's just like a straight up correlation, going up codependent with each other. And it just like, it's kind of amazing, right? Now you could, in theory, like warn people when they check and code into the repositories to kind of like integrate that into the process, and kind of, because you can't, like, you're also outnumbered. Like, there's very few security people, there's a lot of developers, right? And everybody's writing code all the time. And now when we have like the AI generated code, like, everybody's going to be a developer, and we're going to have even more of like sort of, lots of generated. Speaking of AI, the funny part to me is AI right now, like generative AI, is like it's very, very good. LLMs are very good at generating answers, and they're very helpful if you know how to evaluate the quality of the answer, right? So if you know how to say this is good or bad, then they will get you 80% there, like most of the time, and like, you are going to just move faster and do better. But if you don't know how to evaluate the quality of the answer, and you just blanket accept everything I say, like, a lot of people, I think, don't even think about the fact that like LLM is just speaking very confidently. It doesn't have to give you the right answer, right?
Typical white guy behavior, right?
I was trying to avoid saying that, but like, yeah, it's like
See, that's the
this
benefit
is,
of being a white guy. I can say that.
yeah. I think I was mentioning it last week, like on the podcast, like there was a case, law case where the lawyers like used ChatGPT to prepare and showed up and quoted cases, and the cases didn't exist because like the GPT just generated cases that looked right with examples and whatever, and this just wasn't part of the legal system. And it shows you how like there's also someone ran a study about like basically developers just accept the Copilot sort of suggestions blanket, like just click accept all the time. And so it's like, yes, the acceptance rate is very high, but is it because people actually know what they're doing and they think the answer is correct, or is it because they don't know what they're doing and they're just like, this must be fine, like, right? So,
Listen, having been a developer in the past, none of us know what we're doing.
yeah, like I mean, I do agree with that. Like technology just moves too fast. So it's like you can be. I know some developers are like experts on a particular topic or a particular language, but majority of us hop between like different technologies all the time, and it's like we're just sort of jack of all trades, master of none, and like you just can't know everything. Um,
Even the ones that are experts in specific fields kind of skim over all the other areas. Because if you're a master of a very specific, deep, narrow knowledge, you can skip over all the other stuff, like, I don't know, input validation and database and whatever, because you're an expert on this kind of algorithm.
Okay, so like I feel like we're getting into this spot where like it's kind of depressing because like we're relying on humans and some, you know, AI to build things, and neither of these things is perfect. And like we're we're kind of creating a lot of problems on the way. It's like, so how do we get better? How do we improve this?
That is so far above my pay grade. I don't even know. The best option I can offer is threat modeling. But basically, again, threat modeling is thinking about what can go wrong, being skeptical about this great, perfect design and component that I built, and understanding that, yes, it can be broken in different and interesting ways. As much as developers are like water, so are attackers, right? The problem with threat modeling is it really does not scale. Not even close. You said we're
Okay.
outnumbered. I mean, there's like, I think the statistics are like 100 developers to one security person. And that
Yeah, it was
security
something
person,
like
most of them don't know anything about development. So, yeah, even worse. And so it really doesn't scale. It's just, and this is why you've mentioned before about changing processes and culture, about getting developers to know how to do these things, right? Getting them to think about it, not as a separate thing. Okay, I'm done developing. Now I'm going to go do the DevSecOps after I'm done with the DevOps. But rather, this is why I say it needs to go away. I feel like we completed that whole circle now. This is why I say DevSecOps needs to go away. It just needs to be DevOps. It's not secure development. It's just development. That's just the way we do it.
okay, interesting. So I guess for folks who are less familiar with threat modeling, and like I said, I feel like so some places do threat modeling all the time, but I would say majority of places don't do any or very limited, or like, you know, when the product is first introduced, they will do a session or two, but then like you continue development for years and like never think about it again, kind of thing. Um, and like I said, most people try to get around it of like by putting tools, automated tools into that, which is again has its own downsides. So for people who are not familiar, or for people who are like, where do I get started, or like how do I convince my boss that this is a good idea? Like talk a little bit about threat modeling.
So you're absolutely right about what you said, and I'm going to start with the last question. How do I get started? I would say, go to read the threat modeling manifesto, because it had two purposes. One, how to even get started. What are the basics to even go? And it's not prescriptive. It's just rather a concept, a mode of thinking about things. The second part of the manifesto was, okay, let's say I've been doing threat modeling in some form for several years. How do I know if it's good or bad? How do I improve? And you're absolutely right. I would say most places don't do it at all. And those that do, many of them do it poorly. And a good example of doing threat modeling poorly is hiring Avi to come in and do a great big threat model when you're introducing a new product, and then ignoring the results, and 2 years later, not having done any more threat modeling.
So I shouldn't hire Abby.
Not to do the threat model, no, because I spend more time. The past several years, I've done a lot more effort. I've been pushing back on clients that want me to come in and do a threat model for them. And I could spend 3 weeks or 2 months and come back with a massive Excel sheet with several hundred threats and go ahead and fix all these issues. I'd rather spend that time training and educating and shifting mindsets of the development teams, and that includes the developers, the dev leads, the architects, the product managers, DevOps, getting everybody involved and saying, we're going to shift our mode of thinking, we're going to change our workflow, and start involving threat modeling throughout the process. From the very beginning, from the product manager first defines what that feature is, when we first define what those user stories are, threat modeling needs to be embedded as part of that, which means it's not a great big threat model. I like to compare this to Thanksgiving. All my metaphors are always food related. Thanksgiving, right? You go, you gorge yourself, you have a great big meal, and then you don't want to see your family for an entire year. Compare that to eating 3 square meals a day, or constantly snacking on grazing a little bit all day long. Threat modeling is just thinking about whatever you're doing, think a little bit about security. The interesting thing is that most people do this intuitively in real life, right? You walk down a dark street, drive down a dark street, you lock your car doors, right? I always say, if you're buying or building a house on the first floor, you're probably going to want to put bars on your first floor window, right? Because you're worried about velociraptors or thieves. I don't know. Whatever your threat model is, but you have this internal model. What are the things that I worry about internally? Now, it doesn't mean that you're an expert in securing a house, but you have this internal model. Somehow, when it comes to software and tech and all that stuff, people just, well, it's, I guess whoever built it is an expert. Who's ever taking care of it is the expert. I don't need to worry about this at all, even when we're the people building it. So threat modeling is just that frame of how to break it down and look for those issues and find them.
I think one of my favorite metaphors when I was talking to people about security was like we're doing this analog of building a grand big house, like installing all the fancy equipment, TVs, marble bathrooms, whatever, and then we're like, oh, we'll get to locks on the doors when we have time for it. It's like, what are you doing? Like, right? Like, that's not what you do in real life. Like, you don't think like that, right? So it's like,
Exactly.
it shouldn't be an afterthought. It should, like, you should start with, and again, just like with locks on the doors, I think it's a good metaphor because anything makes it better, right? So you could have, you know, say bars on the windows, but you could also like just having an open window is sort of an invitation. Like it's easier to break in. Like the more sort of guards you put around, the more secure you are. Just because like you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the next person. Like right?
Yes, exactly.
Probably not the best metaphor, but like yeah, if your house is harder to break into than the next house, like then probably you're safer. So you know.
And it's not about making anything 100% secure. There's no such thing. It's never 100% secure. And it's about making it more secure than would have been otherwise. Is this effort, and this is one of the things that we always ask at the end of the process, did we do a good job, right? So threat modeling is about answering 4 questions. What are we working on? What's the system? How does it work? All the details. How can it go wrong? The threats. How can it be abused, misused, bypassed, exploited? A third, what are we going to do about it? Based on your understanding, priorities, you're going to design countermeasures. But then it's always important to ask ourselves, did we do a good job? Not only, did we miss anything? Do we need to do more stuff? How bad is our threat model? Because, all models are wrong. Some are useful. But a big part of that question is how effective, how efficient was our use of the time? Was it worth our time that we invested? Now we got 15 of the smartest people in the company, and we spent an hour and a half or 3 weeks doing this threat modeling. Was it worth it? It better be worth it, otherwise people are not going to come back.
So in terms of modifying processes, right? It's difficult. Like you said, education doesn't always work. Tools don't always work. Both of these things help, right? If you have the right tools, it's easier to do the job. I'm not dismissing tools. Tools are important, right?
Absolutely.
If you have the information, it's easier to do a good job. But like learning is changing behavior. Learning is not just like I can give you cognitive learning all day and you're going to go home and do exactly the same thing you did before. In fact, like we all know how to exercise to have a six-pack abs, like yet none of us has six-pack abs, like because knowledge is just
it's too much damn work.
Yeah. Right. So what's been successful for you in terms of that ability to like if you come in and people don't think about security, how do you sort of educate them and convert them and introduce them to integrating that sort of into their development operations process?
Well, first I start by scaring them and telling them that their house will burn down. No, I don't really. Actually, it's interesting because one of the most important things in a lot of organizations that I come in, and maybe the security team is definitely on board, even the VP R&D might be on board, but the developers, it's going to be too much work. So sometimes the most important thing is showing them that it's not that big a deal. It's not scary. It makes sense for you to be doing this because, like that chief architect said, you should be doing this anyway. And it's not a huge amount of work. It doesn't mean that you're going to lose out on your bonus this year. It doesn't mean that you have to stay weekends. And part of that, a big part of that means, well, that great big threat model that used to take 2 months to do, we can't be doing that every feature. So we need to be flexible in our way of thinking and flexible in our application of techniques and methodologies, because there'll be features that, we don't need to do a full-size threat model. We don't need to spend 3 weeks doing this. It's okay to spend 20 minutes to think about it. Sometimes we do need to spend more, right?
Yeah.
So I show, I do a lot of training and I work with a lot of developer teams and I give them kind of an array of different approaches and techniques and say, you choose. I give them the criteria to think about what's important, leave it up to their own judgment call based on that context. But then they need to decide, do less where you are comfortable doing less so that they will do more where they feel it's necessary. It comes back to that feeling of ownership, giving developers ownership of their security.
So it's interesting because yeah, I do definitely run into and this in terms of developers pertains to everything. Like, right, testing is not my job, QA is not my job, security is not my job, accessibility is not my job. Like, right, like it all like especially the less technical you get, sort of the more not my job you get around things. But it's also about so we talk about changing habits and what looks like resistance. So BJ Fogg is a guy who developed like kind of this motivational model of like how you get people to do things, which he's taught classes at Stanford that all the social media gurus have like startups have attended. So like he's responsible for all of us being addicted to social media indirectly. But basically, so what he talks about a lot is what looks like resistance is oftentimes lack of clarity. So if I keep telling someone like, oh, you gotta, clean the coffee machine after you make coffee, and that person just isn't doing it, and like, they seem obstinate, they seem resistant, they seem to just not like care about, my requests, and then it's like if you start asking them questions, they're like, they literally physically don't know what to do, and it's too much undertaking, it's too scary, and they just like give up before they start, right? So like a lot of this is like what's the clear path to like how do I actually do this? What are the steps, breaking it down into like do you understand this, do you understand this? And then the second part of it is just having like sort of prompts or triggers to like do the step, like have some type of thing that like prompts you to actually remember that you needed to do the step, which is another important thing. Because like a lot of times it's also not that we don't want to do something, but we just have nothing. Like our normal process is like go straight, right? So we don't remember that we need to take this extra step here.
Yeah, this really resonates because I see a lot of security people, especially the fudders, that like saying, think like an attacker. They tell developers, think like an attacker. Not only is that counterproductive, it's the exact same situation that you're saying that offers no guidance whatsoever. Sasha, quick, think like a chef. Think like a chef. That's not doesn't help me cook better, right? It still doesn't help me learn how to make a better soup.
Like maybe like so again, if I have enough context, I can think like a chef. If I don't have any context,
Context is not, yes, context, but also experience and education and knowledge and all that stuff. Think like an attacker is even worse because developers don't think like attackers. They think like developers, right? That's why I hate that saying so much. It just doesn't work that way. And you know what? Sometimes I'll run into a developer that does like thinking like an attacker, and 9 times out of those 10, they're either were QA in the past, or they'll move into QA, or they'll move into security. They simply won't stay as developers because it's a different way of thinking.
so this is interesting. I actually haven't thought about this, but you're talking about how like QA is closer to security mindset than because it's about breaking things. So
Well,
it's just interesting.
to some parts of security, okay, my mindset of security isn't about breaking things. It's about building things better. But a large part of, I would say, a majority of people in the security field are about breaking things. Pen testers and analysts and research.
Breaking
Right?
things is fun. So I'll come
Yeah.
back to my experience, like, and I think the biggest shift for me, like as a developer, was like playing the games, like right, because playing the games introduced me to how I used to make mistakes that I didn't even know were mistakes. Because like all I'm looking for is like, how do I make this code work? I'm not thinking about like how can you break this? Like where is the attack vector for and you just like there's some very such common things that like we should just teach people like it's but it's I think for me it was sort of easier to see like if someone just came in and gave me a lecture on the top 10 ways to break software, I'd nod to it and kind of move on. But once you start to like play these games and then you're like, okay, here's how I can break into here, it's like, okay, I probably shouldn't be writing it like this.
Yeah, no, that's true, and I've done some of that. I still do it once in a while. I don't love it, but I do it once in a while. Teaching those basic stuff. There's the OWASP top 10, things like SQL injection and cross-site scripting and stuff like that. And once you see it, you start to notice it, and you start to recognize it, and you move on. But I don't think we need to be wasting time on that because for two reasons. Number one, it can easily be found by things like static analysis and web scanners and stuff like that. And even more importantly, the frameworks we use should be protecting against that anyway. It shouldn't be an option, or it shouldn't be a default option at the very least.
So talk a little bit about that, like what frameworks and how do they protect against it?
So most frameworks that most developers use nowadays are secure by default. If you use even Ruby on Rails, you have active record that by default you don't have SQL injection. You can go out of your way and do that if you want to, right? If you use most common web frameworks, whether it's Python or Java or .NET or Node.js, if you use things in the normative default way, you will be secure from a lot of these things. As you mentioned, though, that developers are like water. They'll find a non-default, non-normative way of doing things.
And like you said, like when you start looking on Stack Overflow or when you start using GitHub code examples, like lots of them are written before any of these protections existed, and so like you could very easily end up with code, and some of it is even like it's like there's this one line of code that will solve your problem instead of 10 lines of code, and usually developers will go for like the elegant way, which sometimes it's a less secure way, right? Because it's hacking around the protections. Yeah. So you are on the OWASP board of directors, right?
This is true.
So talk a little bit about that. I feel like, to me, that's a great organization in terms of kind of educating people and kind of doing all this work around okay, how do you even do this? Like, what should you think about, right? So it's to me is very important for that from that perspective. But talk a little bit about what the goals of OWASP are and what do you do?
Yeah, I hope most of your listeners are familiar with OWASP, but if not, go check out OWASP.org. Stands for Open Worldwide Application Security Project. Basically, it's an open source community, one of the larger security communities in the world, dedicated to building more secure software. That's it. Through education, things like the OWASP Top 10, there's the OWASP cheat sheets, an amazing resource on so many different languages and technologies. You can go check it out. And just a short, no fluff, just simple, direct action items. Do this, 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 and this, and you'll be secure from those issues. There's a whole lot of other documentation. There's a bunch of software that you can just run and use, things like OWASP Zap as an interactive web proxy or web scanner. Things like dependency track and dependency check to find out if any of the dependencies your software is using has known vulnerabilities. Cyclone DX to create an SBOM, software bill of materials, and a bunch of other stuff. There are also chapters all over the world. I'm also one of the leaders of the Israel chapter. We had a great conference middle of May, about a month and a half ago, around 700 people. There's supposed to be another great big global AppSec in, I think, at the end of October in Washington, D.C. If anybody's around, I strongly suggest going there. And there's a lot of chapters. Almost any large city, any place there's a large conglomeration of high-tech companies, there will be a OWASP chapter. And if you happen to be in a city where there's not, you can just start your own. It's an open source community. Go ahead and start it and start getting more people involved in the community. And this is how we learn. We learn from each other, right? And even the biggest experts out there consistently say they just learn from each other. I'm not one of the biggest experts, but I definitely learn from everybody else there. And this is how I learn, by coming to these events and meetups and just learning from each other. Yeah.
So is part of the sort of goal of this, like, I mean, technology evolves fast, right? Which means security evolves fast. Like, is part of the goals of OWASP kind of like updating the guides and like thinking about like what's next, and like is that part of it?
Constantly. There are so many different. I think there's like 250, maybe 300 different projects right now, focused on a wide range of different technologies. There's a couple on machine learning and AI. There's one on blockchain. There's a ton of stuff on mobile security. The OWASP Top 10, which is probably the best well-known project, which is not a standard or compliance or anything like that. It's just an awareness document. Gets updated every 3 to 4 years based on a huge amount of data analysis and community input, and everything is transparent in the open. There's also a really wonderful standard known as the ASVS, the Application Security Verification Standard, which is a literal standard that you can certify an application according to. And it's just a set of security requirements throughout different categories in your application at different levels. Level 1 is the type of app that any app should comply with, whether you're a simple cat blog or anything simply being on the internet, up to level 2, secure application. Level 3 has really, I think, close to 300 different requirements for, biggest of the banks and, life-threatening systems. And it's a great system and it constantly gets updated as well, again, by all those experts that are consistently contributing and collecting information from the community. Open source, fine.
Nice. And I know you just mentioned like some of it is not compliance standards, right? And because it's like run a global organization, not a government or anyone who can require you to be compliant. But I do find that security tools often use these as a guide for like how to identify what they need to take care of.
Yeah, no, this is true. Most security tools will categorize things according to the OWASP top 10, which the original creator of the top 10 has said this has been a terrible mistake, and if only they could retract that. Because the top 10 is not compliance, it's not prioritized, it's an awareness document. That's it. It's just for
Okay.
awareness. Basically, if you're getting started in security, go learn the top 10. It's a great place to learn what security means. Is this complete? No, of course not. Don't forget the top 11, top 32. There's hundreds of issues, and the top 10 is not specific or granular or objective in any way. It's just a set of examples.
Okay, so interesting. So is like I sense some hard feelings. So is the hard feelings around
Frustration.
frustration, right? Is it around like the compliance in general, like taking security as a compliance thing, or is it more about like top 10 was not intended for that, so it's not complete or thorough enough kind of
Yeah,
thing?
yeah, in this case, it's specifically the last one. The top 10 document itself explicitly says it's not a standard. There's no compliance that is relevant here because it's just awareness. Do not use this as a checklist or as a risk prioritization mechanism. And yet, so many organizations build a risk prioritization mechanism around compliance with top 10. So many security scanners and vendors categorize this according to the top 10. It's not a
Okay.
taxonomy.
Okay, so that's interesting, and again, this brings me to like my love-hate relationship with manifestos, right? It's like words are really useful, but also they have downsides. Right? Once you write something down, the downside is that people will treat it as like set in stone, like this is the Ten Commandments. It's like this is what you should do, right? And that can become problematic in itself. So it's interesting, yeah, to look at
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. Yeah. But if you want compliance, if you want to know that your application is secure, that's what the SVS is for, right? That's exactly what it is.
So it's like much more thorough and talks about like
It's more thorough, more granular. It's still a generic. You still need to do a process of applying this to your application because nothing will be 100% exact to your specific app, whatever you're building, because your product is different from everybody else's. I mean, that's kind of the point, right? Um, your context is different. So you still need to go through that, whether it's via threat modeling, and when I teach threat modeling, I include the SVS as part of the output of that, or just taking that and just filtering for what actually matters for
so I want to shift topics a little bit, and
you.
I want to we spent a lot of time talking about developers, right? And in general, like our entire industry is currently very oriented towards developers, developer experience. It's tools for developers. It's things that like tools for security that integrate into development. And this is like, I'm a huge fan of all of this, right? But I feel like we're consistently sort of leaving operations out of this, like, right? And like majority of our interaction with software is operations, right? Because your software is running, like, especially now when like everything is a SaaS product, right? So your software is running somewhere, there are people operating it usually at a large scale. The more successful your product is, the more operations are crucial. So what's the bad side of the coin? So like how do you integrate security into operations? What should people think about when they're doing it?
Well, as the CEO of Microsoft once said, DevOps, 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 right? Um, no, that's not what he said. But yeah, it's still, to my mind, it's still a part of the product development, right? Because it's not, well, we're done developing it, and now that's it. We're stopping. It's always ongoing, right? And I include in that, by the way, I include the architects, I include QA, I include product management as well. End to end is all part of that product development organization. That process of, we are a software organization. Our job is to develop develop a software product and sell this to our customers in one way or the other. And yes, ops is of course a big part of that. There are some things in OWASP that apply to DevOps as well. There's plenty of things relating to whether it's okay. you're going to get angry at me because DevOps, in this context, I'm talking about like cloud deployment and not the culture. But that's also part of it. I think the place where DevOps gets most involved, DevOps folks get most involved with security. You'll see this. I see this very often with threat modeling instances. Because when we do these exercises, very often, if there's no DevOps in the room, they'll always be, oh, I don't know how that's deployed. Oh, I don't know what the architecture actually is. Oh, what kind of service is that? What kind of data? I don't know. Well, why are they not in the room? So I always make sure that they're in the room, because they always have a different perspective from the developers, from the architects, and even from all the other stakeholders in the room.
So that is a core tenet of DevOps, like, right? Like, round up the stakeholders that are not just your team, but the other teams that are working with, and especially operations, right? In that context.
Cross-functional teams. This is something that in the threat modeling world, they've been talking about long before Agile. I remember in 2006 is the first time I heard this, but not in that term. It's literally, as you said, just get all the stakeholders in the room. I mean, that's what a cross-functional team is, but we didn't have the word for it. That's what we said.
And then in terms of runtime, right? Because like a lot of the bad stuff that happens actually during runtime, right? And so we have tools for, I guess, testing the runtime, but like what's kind of like, in your experience, a good way to think about security at runtime, at like operating application, like that correlates with also performance and reliability and all of these nice abilities that we need.
Yeah, and logging and auditing and active alerting and correlations and all that, and monitoring. Observability is a word, big term that's been taking off several years. And the past couple of years, I've been hearing it in the context of security as well. I'm not going to mention a specific vendor, but a big vendor in that space actually has been moving into the security space as well. And now they, acquired some security companies. They have some great security people on the team. And because if you can see what your users are doing, if you can see what is going on, you could also see what the attackers are doing. You could also correlate, well, this is actually different from our regular users. Is this on purpose? Is this what's supposed to happen? And you can get a lot of intelligence from that.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely core, right? Monitoring and observability, if you're more advanced, because like I find that a lot of people don't even like kind of do monitoring at a good enough level, right? So like it's great to talk about like having bigger goals, but the I think it's absolutely crucial, right? Because that's a big part of security. Just being able to understand what users are doing with the system, and also observe if anything is out of the ordinary. But also like, if you don't know how your system is being used, you're probably not going to identify any security threats or security incidents, or be able to investigate them, right? Again, another part of kind of auditing and monitoring stuff.
The other side of that is, when you want to go and change something, you want to build a countermeasure, how do you know if this will harm usability or not? How do you know if this will get in the way or not? If you don't have that visibility, if you don't have that view on how users are doing. I like to say, I have a rule bouncing around the internet on my name now. Security at the expense of usability comes at the expense of security. There is no such thing as unusable security.
Interesting. So it's okay. This, I don't know, maybe this is the last topic for today, but a lot of times people think about security as a gatekeeper, as that evil person, like, right, like that's preventing them from either pushing features or again having usable software. So like it's either impacting performance, or it's impacting my ability to ship code fast, or like whatever, like, right? So it's kind of like a blocker to the conversation. How do we get around this? Like both in terms of like our ability to introduce security as a positive, and in terms of like is there a good practice for like how do you actually integrate it without causing issues?
I try to teach the security teams, instead of being the office of no, to be the office of yes and, or yes how, right? We'll solve it. We'll figure it out. If there's a business case for it, then there's a security case for it. We just need to figure out how to do this right, how to do this well. Part of the way I approach security, I like to call it value-driven security, because if you have as much approaching perfect security as you can, that's going to start causing business problems. It's going to start cutting off whether it's revenue streams or functionality or usability or anything else that actually drives the bottom line, which is what we as security should be protecting. So it's about focusing on that value chain that I know that you like talking about, value chain, value stream, and things like that. And there's ways of tailoring security around that as well to protect the value stream instead of just following some generic checklist.
So it's a very interesting, like I like what you said, because if you just say no, right, people will go around you. Like they will get an exception, they will or just ignore your guidelines or whatever. Like, right?
Best case
People
scenario,
will,
they'll ignore you.
right. So like as a security officer of any kind, or the security team, you can't just blanket say no to people. But yeah, I guess it makes you be this sort of great, security people are sort of in this tough spot where they lose sleep over security issues, but then they have to sort of introduce security into teams that may or may not be invested in the outcome, and so it's a tough place to be.
So if your security team is aligned with the value chain or value stream, well, then they are aligned. Well, then the rest of the teams are going to be interested because you're actually producing value in some way, whether it's like insurance, protecting that value, or in some cases, even adding additional security functionality, additional benefits. There are a lot of SaaS solutions out there that have a higher package, that the higher levels of customers, you get additional security functionality, whether it's additional management, additional, identity management and roles and more granular permissions. That's some of the popular things there, or connected to your internal identity management. These are great features that can come out of thinking, what actually sells software? Why do users come to us? Why do customers buy our software? What is it they want? Let's give them more securely.
So sort of security as a differentiator, right? Security as a direct line to revenue, right?
Sometimes.
Something, yeah, it's not always relevant to all applications and to all products, but it can definitely be. And then yeah, it's so maybe, I don't know, I put you on the spot, but you kind of said that the threat modeling exercises were sometimes very useful to even developing a product, right? Do you have an example of I can see how this just makes products better, because the more you think about how people interact with your software, the more use cases you're going to address, or sort of mishaps you're going to fix and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So we're about at time. Just to leave our listeners with something interesting to look into. I know you already mentioned the OWASP top 10, and then the threat modeling and manifesto, that are kind of easy to consume resources to get started in this space that might be interesting to folks.
Although I would rather refer to people to the OWASP cheat sheet than the top 10.
Okay.
It's a lot more useful. It's an incredible. I made people cry with it the first time they've seen it.
Cry? Okay. Why? How?
Oh my God, this is what I'm looking for my whole life.
Okay, this is good. This is good. So if you wanna cry from joy, check out the OWASP cheat sheet. And then is there anything else, anything that you've recently learned or discovered, or like to introduce people to, that they should take away?
I have actually been diving more and more into the privacy field as well, which is not really a subset of security in any way, but there is a lot of overlap, especially around threat modeling. And there are approaches around that to find privacy threats in similar ways, but slightly different. And I'm finding more and more value in that as well, because that gives a lot of perspective on the actual business processes, the actual business flows, what your users actually care about. And it's not always what you initially think.
Interesting. That's interesting. It's a whole other topic to look into. And again,
Yes.
knowledge in the world is vast, and yeah. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure. And I hope we get to chat again soon. And thanks everyone so much for being here. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye.